All right, welcome to the intro to the HTML portion of this course. Uh, in general, there's going to be a disclaimer. This is going to be a fire hose exercise of HTML. And the reason for that is because we got to get through these technologies, all three of them, the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so we can start using them together so you can actually understand how the web works. If we spend too much time on any one topic, you're not going to have a solid understanding of how everything actually works together. And don't freak out at this point because even if you don't understand it, even if you don't understand it 4 or 5 days from now and you're still practicing, that's okay. You're going to be using these concepts over and over and over again for this course and for every other course moving on. These are the fundamentals. You're not going to get away from them. Okay? With that out of the way, we can actually jump into this. So let's start with a small example of what we are going to be doing today. And I really want you to look at this that is being presented, and when we go over the presentation, how the things that we're going over actually relates back to this. So this is a very small example of what we're getting after here. So we have the doc type up here. The doc type is actually going to tell the browser which version of HTML to use. In this class, we're going to be using HTML5. Occasionally, if you're going to be out in the workforce, you might run into an HTML4 standard, which is a little bit different. And when you run into that, just be aware that there are differences. But for what we're trying to accomplish here, don't worry about HTML4 at this point. Okay, so we got our HTML tag. This is the root of the document, and we will be going over this shortly. We have our body tag, and then we have a div. This is a header tag. Here is another div. Here is a list of spans. We're ending that div that we started up here. Here's another div. Image. Ending that body tag that started up here. And ending that HTML tag that we started up here. And here is what that looks like. Okay. So we got the H1 tag. We have the div. Here are all your spans. And here's that image. And notice that anything that doesn't have content in it directly, it's not showing up. There's no, hey, HTML here, or there's no div around this image. There are a few things. As long as it has content, it's going to be displayed to the user and displayed on the browser. However, there are lots of tags that don't show up. And the reason for this is because it gives us the ability to address the structure. So when we have a little bit more complexity, we can actually do what we want. And this is what we mean by HTML is the structure of the website. Okay, so let's move on and start talking about why some of these things are the way they are. So the first thing that we got to do is we have to establish the DOM. And what the DOM stands for is Document Object Model. And what this is essentially a standard way of organizing your HTML. Okay, so if we look over here on the DOM on the right hand side here, notice that our HTML object right here is the root. We have our head tag, which is directly under the HTML. We have our meta tags inside of the header, our CSS inside of the header, and then the JavaScript, depending on your use case, can be in the header as well. So this is a bunch of metadata about the HTML document. Okay, we have our body tag. Most things, especially the stuff that you're going to be displaying to the user, is going to be inside of that body tag. So we have header, the not be confused with head tag. The header, which you would be showing on your application, is generally the navigation. Now that's changing with mobile first design, where the navigation can easily be at the bottom. However, most scenarios, you're still going to have the navigation at the top. Then we have nav content, and then sub nav content, so your drop downs. Okay, notice that there's another section here and another section here. Okay, body, and then you're going to have your content, so whatever that is for that project. This can get very big. And then if we come back up here, we still have our footer. And then footer typically has content, but it's very much like the header. So all the things you typically find in the footer, so your contact us, our links to other sites, our affiliates, things like that typically go in the footer. Now, one of the things that we need to talk about is terminology as well. So there are people that are definitely going to refer to this as a nested string array, which there's a reason for that, and we'll get to that more in the JavaScript portion, but a lot of people refer to this as a jagged array as well. And the reason for this is because you're nesting arrays in arrays. So it's not a linear path of arrays. Okay. The DOM, especially how it's organized, also determines your bubble and capture events. Again, another JavaScript topic, but it's something to be exposed to here because it does determine these things, and we'll get into it more when we get into events in JavaScript, which that's going to be a few presentations away. Okay. Now we got to talk about blocking elements. So the first one, and the most commonly used one, is a div. So if we go back to our small example here, here's a div, here's a div, here are all these divs. So divs start on a new line, and that is done through what is called a break tag. You simply just don't see it. The browser renders that for you, okay? So block elements always start on a new line unless you're using a Flexbox, essentially just a styling paradigm, Flexbox or CSS Grid. That's the only time that divs are going to be on the same line, but there's some trickery going on there. Block level elements also take up the full width because of its nature, where it always starts on a new line. Now, with that said, I went over this kind of quick, but if you want a more detailed example and a little bit more detail about what blocking elements actually are, W3C has excellent docs on this. And more importantly, what I really want to draw your attention to is that here is the entire list of block elements right here. So you don't necessarily have to memorize these. W3C has done the work for you. You just have to be able to find where to look and find the answer to that problem. And this is going to be a common theme throughout the entire course and your technical career. You do not necessarily want to memorize everything. You don't necessarily need to have everything on recall. You do need to remember where to find that answer. And the reason why we say this is because it's basically impossible to memorize everything. In fact, I'll go out on a limb and say it is impossible to memorize everything. It's not going to happen, right? But you do need to be able to solve the problem. And most of the time you do that through breaking down your problems into small chunks and then finding it in the docs and solving that problem one step or one byte at a time. Okay, so let's move on. Inline blocking elements. So we use the example of span from the last example. So if we come back up here, here's all of our spans. So exactly how the name suggests, these are inline elements. So this is going to display one by one on top of each other. So let's go back to our example here. Oh, here we go. And here are the spans, at how they actually look on the DOM as they're displayed to the user. So span 1, span 2, span 3, and span 4. So, same thing with blocking elements. W3C has done the work for you. There is a list of all your inline elements. Again, don't memorize these. Go look it up. Just remember where to find this answer when you need it. Okay? The biggest difference between a block element and an inline element is that an inline element is on the same line. Okay? Attributes. This is a very important topic, and this is something you're going to have to memorize. And again, this is another mental model. You do not have to memorize all the attributes that go with particular tags, and especially when you start moving on in your career and you have custom attributes for web components, for example, you can't know what it is because they're custom components. You have to be able to go find that answer. So, but at this level, attributes is a way of describing a particular tag and to give it particular properties. So the image example here is one of which where you have to give it a file, and most of the time you're going to have to give it a file path to that file. But in this case, we're just giving it a file, and then it's going to display that image on the DOM. So again, if we come back up here to our example, we did exactly that with this picture here, and if we show exactly how we did that, here's our image tag, source, and this is the file path that we were talking about earlier. We went up a directory, pictures, glue.jpg. Okay, so that's exactly how we accomplished that. Attributes. Okay. Attributes are also defined in the start of the tag. So this image example is not a very good example of that. So let's try to find another one. And I don't have one right offhand. So we'll go over that here in a second when we're doing the lab portion of this presentation in a few minutes. Okay. So we are back to our original example here. And now we're going to go over tags themselves. So naturally, we have to start with HTML. HTML tag is the start of the document, is the root of the document. The only time, or the only tag really, that is not inside of the HTML tag is this doc type, which determines which HTML version that we're going to use. Okay, so HTML is the root. Again, W3C has the answers for you if you ever get confused or lost on what these tags are. Okay, div. Okay, creates a division of the page. That's what it stands for, page division. All right. Most of the time, I'm going to be using divs for my content. Occasionally, I'll need a span, but for the most part, it's going to be a div. Okay, span. I already went over it. Right, the inline element. Again, it's a container, it's just displayed in line, very similar to div, except for, again, it's displayed in line. Okay, H1 to H6, these are header tags. And the reason why these function like divs, first of all, but second, there's some styling applied to them that the browser does for you. And then this is also going to help your screen readers navigate through the document. Now, we're not going to be doing accessibility in this course. Really, the disclaimer that I want to point out to you is that even though they have default styles applied to them, do not use these header tags for font size, right? And this is a typical mistake that beginners do because it's, you're always exposed to the HTML first and you want to give different sizes to your text, and this is an easy way of doing that if you don't know CSS. So don't do that. We'll be going over CSS here very shortly, and don't be using this as text styling because you're going to screw up your screen readers. And we'll have another course on accessibility eventually, but not for this. It's out of scope. All right. A tags. Some people call them anchors. Some people call them action tags. I'm going to refer to it as an A tag, but a action tag. So This is again defines a hyperlink. And again, we're going to need to pass in a attribute. This time it's href, right, for hyperreference, hypertext reference. And then we're going to pass in that path, okay? And then this right here is what's going to show up as that link. That blue text or that underline is the link, very similar to what this is right here. Okay, image tag. We've used image tag a few times already. Okay, source attribute, give it a file path, and then the file itself. And then that's going to be inside of that image tag. One thing that you may or may not have noticed at this point, that everything else has a closing tag to it. Image can be self-closing. You can put text inside of the image tag itself. Generally frowned upon. You're going to want to use a span or a div to put text next to an image, but it can be done. So this is where you don't have a closing image tag, perfectly fine. Okay, Canvas used to draw graphics, typically used with JavaScript, because if you're going to use Canvas to apply an image, you might as well just use the image tag. Okay, table, I need to go over tables. It is a legacy tag, it is a legacy paradigm, but you're going to see it everywhere in older references, and a lot of you are going to be using Stack Overflow. I don't recommend that, especially at your level, because you don't necessarily understand what you're looking for, particularly if you're going to try to copy and paste something. It's probably not going to work. But tables, at this point, should be avoided. If you're going to need something in a table-like structure, we'll be going over CSS Grid here shortly in the next couple presentations. You should be using CSS Grid or Flexbox. I have a preference for CSS Grid, but this is an old paradigm, and the reason why we're moving away from this is because tables don't help out your accessibility very well, and are also SEO is kind of rough as well if you use tables. Okay, head tag is metadata about the HTML document. Okay, I don't know what else to say about that, and it'll be more clear as we do more examples. But this simple example here, we're adding a title, and don't know what else to say about that. Okay, so form is the last tag that we're going to go over today. Before we get into the practical example here, form is exactly what it sounds like. Those forms that you fill out on the website, where you type something in and then you hit submit and it does something. Okay, for the most part in this course we're going to be using JavaScript to submit forms. However, there is a lot of software out here that uses forms, and you need to be aware of them. So with that said, we can start getting into that practical example I was talking about here a few seconds ago. And what we're going to do is we're going to create some basic HTML. So let's go ahead and close that. We are going to open up. So this is my file structure. You can put your practical examples wherever you want. I'm going to open up this with code. And what this is going to do is open up the entire folder for me. Right here. I'm going to full screen this. Okay. And now I have the entire folder here, so I don't necessarily have to go back to File Explorer to make new files. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this index HTML. So the reason why I called this index is because a lot of your web servers are going to look for that index file, and it is a standard for the most part. What is frowned upon is going to be calling your index file, which should be an index, home or landing page or anything else that would suggest that it's the first page. It really should be called index because that is the standard at this point, unless there's a really good reason not to, and that reason might change eventually, but it doesn't seem like it. So here's this. We have our HTML file. So the first thing that we got to do is we got to tell the browser what type of file that we are giving it in terms of HTML. And notice, and again, this is VS Code, so IntelliSense here is already telling me that, hey, we opened up a tag, there's nothing else here on this file, you should probably be using doctype. So I opened up a tag, I'm going to hit enter here, doctype, HTML. This is going to tell the browser that we're going to be using HTML5. Okay, so we're going to hit enter here, HTML. Again, this is the root. So I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut here for your comments in HTML. It's a little bit different than what you're used to for your C languages. So I'm going to do Control-K-C. Control-K-C. This did the entire line. I was not hoping for that. Okay, so there's that. This is how you do comments in HTML. It is your open brace here, exclamation point, 2 dashes, whatever you want for the comment inside of here. This is multi-lined as well. And then 2 dashes and a closing brace. All right, so we're going to do root of the document. The next thing that we're going to need is the head tag. Okay, so just like what I was talking about during the presentation a few moments ago, don't memorize things if you don't have to. If you're going to be using it over and over and over again, you're naturally going to memorize it. So I don't use meta tags very often. So, like always, I got to go to W3C, and I always search for meta tags like this, because I always forget the syntax for them. So I'm going to copy all of this, and then we're going to get rid of the things that we don't need. But I'm going to explain why we don't need them here in a second. Okay, there we go. So again, this is a meta tag. It's data about the document that we're giving it. So meta, char set, so character set, UTF-8. This is going to tell the browser, hey, how exactly do we want, 1, to parse it, but 2, what characters to expect, essentially. And this is the standard here in America, at least. This is what we're going to be using, UTF-8. There are scenarios where you're going to be using others, but for the most part, it's going to be this. Okay. Again, data about data, metadata. So description, obviously you copy this from free tutorials. Description, keyword, and author. We don't need these things for what we're trying to do here in Intro to Web. So I'm going to get rid of them, but just know that for a SEO purpose, you might need something like this. Now, SEO is changing, where this doesn't really help you as much as it once did, but that might change. The SEO is always changing, so you might need that for the future, but for the time being, we really don't need that. So we're going to get rid of it. And now we're going to focus on this viewport meta tag. And this is essentially saying, hey, how exactly do we want our browser to render particular things at particular sizes? Again, this is another standard. This is exactly what you're going to be copying and pasting inside of your browser. And yeah, just remember where to find this, right? Because this is the standard. Okay. So let's come back up here, give this a comment. Metadata. Okay, and this is where we're going to open up our body tag. So again, body tag. This is where we're going to display our content. Okay, so we're going to do a very basic thing, very similar to the example that we gave during the presentation. Come on, H1. So we're just going to call this, let's do that Aprilia site. Aprilia RS, let's do capitals, RS 660. Okay. And then we're going to give it a div. Now we're going to give this an attribute just to show you what I meant earlier, as in attributes have to go in the start of the tag, which is this. So we're going to call this motor, let's call this RS660 container. And we're going to open up this container now. So there's that. And now we're going to give it an image tag. We're going to give it a source. Now, I do not have an image of this bike. So first thing that we're going to do is go back to our browser. We're going to do Aprilia 660. Going to come here. And then we will save this one. Okay, intro to web, HTML tags, class example. I'm going to put it here. And I'm going to name this bike. All right. We're going to go back to our document, and IntelliSense is going to help us out here a little bit. However, I'm going to have to put this disclaimer out. You have to understand relative pathing. You have to understand pathing in general, particularly when you start talking about custom paths on the server, when you start progressing through the curriculum and your career. So IntelliSense is going to help you out, but it's not perfect. You still have to understand this. So bike, right here, bike JPEG, is in the same level as this HTML file. So for demonstration purposes, I'm going to make a pictures folder, and then I'm going to move this picture into that folder that we just created. Okay, so with that said, it's going to force us to use a path to get to that file now. So if you're not aware, if you need to go up a directory, // okay, and notice that it gave me a bunch of things up one directory, okay, because I have a bunch of files in the parent directory. If you need to stay in the directory, // and notice that it gives me index.html and that pictures folder that we just created, okay? And then if you're trying to do a custom path to the server, at least, it's almost always going to be a / and then something. And notice that I did / and it still came up with the directory that we're currently in. This is part of the reason why IntelliSense is not perfect. So // we're going to go to pictures, and then we're going to go to bike JPEG. We're going to save this, okay? And this is one of the things in terms of extensions that we're going to be using, or at least I'm going to be using quite a bit. I recommend that you install this, but if I come over here and right click, open with live server, you probably don't have this option. So what I did to do this was I searched, well, first I went to the extensions tab, but then I searched live, and then the first one, live server, which is this plugin right here, install it for yourself, and then you're going to have access to that live server. And what this does for us is as we save our HTML file, it will automatically append and do the changes for us without having us refresh the page every time, which is helpful for when you are trying to save something and you're not sure if you actually saved it or not. This is a good way of avoiding that problem, and it saves you time. So we're going to come over here. I'm going to open with live server. It's going to open up this. Okay, so notice that we have our Aprilia RS660, and then we have our image. So notice that it's very large and that we would need CSS to fix this. However, at this level, we haven't went over it yet, so this is what we got. So we have our RS660, we have our image, and we are good to go. All right. One thing I am going to show you, though, is that I'm going to right-click on this. I'm going to go down to Inspect. I am going to fix this real quick. So I'm going to redock my inspector tool. Okay, there's that. Let's move this down. Okay, so this is a little on the big side, so let me make this a little smaller. There we go. Okay, so notice that the browser, the inspector tool, actually shows us exactly what we put in here. So we have our doc type, HTML. We have our HTML tag. We have our head tag. And notice that this is grayed out. The user's not going to be able to see this. Anytime it's grayed out, it's not shown on the DOM. Okay. We have our body tag. We have our H1 tag. We have our div with the ID of the RS660 container. And then we have our image tag. And there's our image. 5,000 by 3,333. It's quite a large image. All right. And then we have our script. Code injected by live server. Okay. So, with that said, that's going to conclude what we were trying to accomplish here with the HTML portion and presentation of this course. Now, by no means are you supposed to be an expert at this point, and we had a very small example. We're going to have to get through the CSS portion before we really even start getting into labs and practice, because it just doesn't make any sense to do HTML by itself. So with that said, if you don't understand what is happening at this point, don't freak out. It's fine. You're going to be okay. And with that said, I'll see you in the next one.